I would like to welcome everyone to the first edition of this Assessment Day, an event conceived and organized by the São Paulo Open Center with the support of Cambridge Assessment English. I'm Fátima Trindade, founder and director of the São Paulo Open Center. As everyone knows, assessment is the bridge between teaching and learning. In this moment of pandemic that ravaged the world, impacting everyone and especially education, our attention turned to the learning process of children and teens, and in particular of our students who have special needs. In this meeting today, we will reflect on the theme, Challenges of Assessing Children's and Teenagers' English Language Development. With the presence and contribution of nationally and internationally renowned professionals, we will have a program that will certainly collaborate with our local and personal challenges. This is undoubtedly a very sensitive and important topic for our pedagogical practices. I hope we have a day of many exchanges and that we leave inspired to return to the second semester classes for those who are in Brazil and proceed with our classroom work along the year for those who are in other parts of the world. I thank everyone for being here. Have a great event. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are. I am Marcio Fernandes, and I will be with you during the whole day, introducing the panelists and each session of the event. I am pedagogical coordinator at São Paulo Open Center, and to begin with, I would like to give you some housekeeping tips. So first of all, our event is divided into 4 sections, and each section has a different link. So in the email that you received, this Zoom link, there are other links, but we will be guiding you through the process of changing links for the roundtable discussions and the afternoon sessions as well. Please address all your questions to our panelists in the Q&A section of Zoom, in the Q&A function, and use the chat box for other non-pedagogical comments. So use the chat box to comment on what you think and etc. But if you have any questions directed to our panelists, go to the Q&A button, please. Also, we will be sending you digital certificates by email next week, certificates of attendance, and our event is recorded. The recordings will be made available in the YouTube channel of São Paulo Open Center soon. And also bear in mind that we are relying on personal Wi-Fi connections. Most of our panelists, they are working from home. So if you listen to other kinds of noises, or if you have any breakdown in communication, please bear with us that we're doing our best in our remote world. For the very first session of the day, I would like to invite Judit Kormos for a session entitled Fairness and Accessibility in Language Assessment for Teenage Language Learners with Specific Learning Differences. Judith is a professor in second language acquisition at Lancaster University. She was a key partner in the award-winning The TEFL project sponsored by the European Commission and a lead educator in dyslexia and foreign language teaching. Massive open online learning course offered by FutureLearn. She's the co-author of the book Teaching Languages to Students with Specific Learning Differences with Anne Margaret Smith. She has published widely on the effect of dyslexia on learning additional languages, including a book entitled The Second Language Learning Processes of Students with Specific Learning Difficulties. She's the author of multiple research papers that investigate the role of cognitive factors in second language acquisition. So Judith, welcome on behalf of São Paulo Open Center. It's a pleasure to have you here. And the stage is all yours. Welcome.
Well, thank you very much for the lovely introduction. And first of all, I'm really grateful to have been invited. I have never given a talk in Brazil, and not even virtually. So this is a great opportunity for me to share some insights about assessment and specific learning difficulties. So I hope you can all see my presentation soon. And I'm going to try to be a bit more interactive in this session. So I might actually ask you to put some things in the chat as we go along. So I'll be also monitoring the chat with in the distance. Anyway, so let me get started. So the title of my talk today is Fairness and Accessibility in Language Assessment for Teenage Language Learners with Specific Learning Difficulties. A lot of the things I'm going to be talking about also applies to younger children, but my research and my work is more concerned with a bit older group of students than the very young learners. So we know that a large proportion of our students, around 10 to 15% of them, have specific learning difficulties, including dyslexia. And it is very important to take these needs into account when you assess students' language knowledge, because we want to make sure that everybody's language competence is assessed fairly, and nobody is unfairly disadvantaged in assessment. And we don't want students to perform poorly because of their disabilities. And we would like to give them opportunities to showcase what it is that they can do. And we know that validity and fairness in assessment are very strongly intertwined concepts. A test which is fair is also valid, and there is no valid test without fairness. And what we also know from research and also pedagogical experience is that fair tests that take into account the needs of students with specific difficulties, and also students more globally, those who have disabilities, are actually helpful for everyone. So we are not just supporting students with disabilities, but we are creating what we call a more universal design in assessment. So just very briefly, for those of you who are perhaps not so much familiar with specific learning difficulties, what are they? One big group which has huge relevance for language teaching and assessment is dyslexia and reading comprehension problems. Another group is dyscalculia, numeracy problems. You wouldn't see such a large effect of dyscalculia on language assessment. Attention deficit and hyperactivity disorder, in some countries it's part of specific learning difficulties, in some it isn't. It is to do with how well students can pay attention to one thing at a time, how long they can focus on one thing, and how easily they can get distracted. And then the fourth group, which in almost every country is part of specific learning difficulties, is dyspraxia, which is concerned with fine and gross motor coordination. Dyspraxic students might have difficulties with handwriting when they are younger, handling maybe cutlery or tying their shoelaces. And very often dyspraxia is interrelated with dysgraphia, and that creates handwriting, spelling, and writing problems more generally. And in some countries, I don't know whether it's the case in Brazil, but in some countries of the world, also autism spectrum disorder. So problems also constitute part of specific learning difficulties. Autism spectrum disorder is to do with social communication, for example. So what is also important to recognize is that these specific learning difficulties often overlap, and they are also placed in a continuum. Different countries have different diagnostic criteria. For some countries, you need to perform, let's say, 2 standard deviation below on certain tests to be diagnosed as having dyslexia or dysgraphia. In other countries, is 1.5. So there is no clear cutoff points. And these learning difficulties also have different degrees of severity. And what it means for us as language educators and also assessors of students' competence is that students with specific learning difficulties can vary a lot. They are can be very different from each other. So generalizations about students' abilities, needs are difficult to make because they are so different. And just very briefly, what are the causes of these specific learning difficulties? I think it's important to be aware of these causes so that you know how to address these challenges when you design an assessment task or when you teach these students. So the key 4 cognitive causes of specific learning difficulties are: the first one, phonological processing problems. So how students perceive and differentiate sounds and how they manipulate sounds. The next one is short-term memory, how many pieces of information you can keep in your mind at a time. For example, if I give you 5 instructions, will you remember all 5 in those steps? Then the next one, which will be quite important for assessment, is speed of processing. Students with specific learning difficulties tend to be slower processing information. And that has implications for assessment because we might need to think about how we can give them more time, how we can support them when they are slower learners. And the fourth one is executive functions, or if we want to state much more simple words, attention problems. Students' attention can easily wander away. They may not be able to focus on one thing at a time. And if you are dyspraxic, and then visual memory and motor coordination problems can also occur. And based on these challenges, these specific learning difficulties do have an impact on second language learning. What do they influence when students learn another language? First of all, reading. We know dyslexia is a reading challenge. So if someone is dyslexic in Portuguese, for example, they will be dyslexic in English or in other language they are learning. So they will have challenges reading in English. Remembering information through listening. Usually students with SPLs are good listeners. They process information much more easily if it's presented through the auditory channel because they don't have to read. But if you present a lot of information that they need to keep in mind, they may not remember everything that you have presented. Specific learning difficulties, particularly dyslexia and dysgraphia, also influence the development of spelling and writing skills. Students with dyslexia tend to struggle with spelling, and again, one early lesson that you might remember is for classroom language assessment in particular. In my experience, very often we put a lot of emphasis on spelling in early stages of language learning, and we have a lot of vocabulary tests where we say, oh, you're only going to get a full point if you spell the word right. Dyslexic students might excel in other ways in second language, but if you only assess spelling or if you put too much emphasis on it, they will struggle. Students with dyslexia tend to also find it difficult to pay attention to 2 things at a time. So if they are speaking, they want to convey a message, but they also have to do it accurately using different grammatical rules, etc., the right vocabulary, then their accuracy may not be in line with their actual knowledge because they can't pay attention to two things at a time, and their speech may not be very coherent because they've got ideas all over the place, and one idea might follow another one. And what we have also found in our research is that students have challenges with acquiring vocabulary. They need a lot more practice and support to remember words. So again, one early lesson, try not to focus too much or only on vocabulary learning in classroom assessment, because if you just assess vocabulary in classroom tests, students with dyslexia may not do so well. So this was just a kind of short introduction to what SPLDs are. And now I'd like to turn our attention to assessment in particular. And in the first part of the remaining time from my talk, I'm going to focus on universal design and fairness, and what kind of special adjustments we can give to students with specific learning difficulties. Then I'll just talk very briefly about two research projects we have conducted and share some insights about what we have learned from these projects regarding giving more time to students and how reading aloud, so presenting students with information through two channels, auditory and visual, can support them. And then in the last part of my presentation, I'm going to discuss some implications for assessment. Right. So a key theoretical construct or theoretical principle in assessment lately has been a universal design. Universal design comes originally from architecture. When new buildings were built, you have to keep in mind how people with disabilities can access buildings, and you have to make sure that you don't disadvantage anyone when you build a new building. And the same thing is true for education. You need to think about how you can design educational materials so that they are accessible for everyone, including students with visual impairments, hearing impairments, specific learning difficulties, etc. So universal design is also applied to the field of language assessment or assessment in more general. And it says that tests should be constructed and administered more flexibly so that accommodations become unnecessary. In other words, we need to try to create tests that support everyone, that are accessible to most students, and this way they don't have to ask for special arrangements or adjustments because they can easily take the test. Now, of course, this will not always be possible. If you think about language assessment, if somebody has visual impairments, they will need some accommodations for reading tests. And then if you have a hearing impairment, obviously you will have some modifications because you can't hear the test very well. But in many other ways, we can actually work towards a universal design by carefully examining what it is we want to test, the test construct, and set tasks that avoid that certain individual characteristics of the test takers cause bias or result in what we call construct irrelevant variance. And just to give you an example, if we have a reading test and we ask questions that require short answers, if these answers are not very short, but longer for reading tests, then maybe students who have dyslexia, they might understand the text, the input text, but they may not be able to write so much within the given time. Or if you think about listening texts that have long instructions, long questions that the students have to answer, maybe the students understood the text, but they don't have enough time. They are slow readers and they can't read the questions that ask about what the text was about. So these are the aspects of the task design that we need to be aware of and think about how it disadvantages students. And as I have said, universal design isn't always fully possible. So we have to provide sometimes modifications. These are changes when we modify the construct that we are assessing. So for example, when we have a hearing impaired student and we say, okay, well, you will not listen to the recording, but we'll give you the transcript and you will be able to read it. Obviously, it's not the same as listening to a test. So that's a modification. We can offer accommodations. These are smaller changes that don't affect the test construct that we are assessing. And this can be modifying the presentation format, changing the font size, for example, for someone who is visually impaired, then changing some of the response formats, the timing of the test and the test setting. I'm going to talk about these accommodations in a moment. So just I can see, let me see how many. Well, there is just 70 of you here, so including the panelists. So I think we can actually type some things in the chat. So what accommodations are currently offered to students with disabilities in high stakes assessment in contexts in Brazil? So what kind of changes can students request? Can you put them in the chat perhaps? First, for high stakes assessment. Okay, so Gladys says by law students have to have more time. That's great. Use of Braille typewriters. Reglets, what's that? Can somebody explain that to me? What reglets are? Mechanical Braille. Okay, thank you. So that's another type of accommodation for students who are visually impaired. Yes, deaf students have interpreters. Students can have a reader. Great, more time. Okay, well, I think you have to make sure that when you write, you don't just write to select panelists and attendees, because I think Gladys and some of you, I'm not sure everyone can see your chat. Okay, more time to finish, bigger letters. Thank you, Angela. Right, okay. Well, what accommodations, if any? So I assume many of you write your own tests also in your classroom. What accommodations do you offer to your own students in the classroom, if any? In addition to these, perhaps, those that students get in high stakes contexts. More time and personal support. That's great. Thank you, Gladys. Audio tests, thank Miriam. Right, so you record the reading for your students. Is that what you mean, Miriam? Yes, okay. So you have some assistants helping the students, more time. Okay. Well, I move on. You can still put your, if you have any other suggestions, you can still put them in the chat. I'll go on and show you what accommodation students can in principle also request. Some of these have been mentioned. So we can actually divide accommodations or adjustments into 4 categories. Accommodations in presentation format, accommodations in response format, accommodations in timing, and accommodations in setting. And presentation format can be oral reading, so a reader or an assistant, larger print, magnification devices, screen readers, depending on the test. So for language assessment, the screen reader might already be considered a modification. Colored overlays for dyslexic students. The evidence about colored overlays is a bit shaky in research, but many students report that they prefer them. So we can provide it for them, but research has shown it doesn't have a significant impact on how well students understand the text, but they are frequently provided. Accommodations in presentation format now actually can be taken care of relatively easily with computerized testing, because a lot of these things students can adjust for themselves now in in computer-based assessment. Then we can support students when they give a response by using a computer. Nowadays, I think all assessment takes place through a computer, but when students have to write in hand in-person tests, some students with dysgraphia were offered the opportunity to write with a computer or use a scribe to dictate to someone who writes their answers. Again, in the time of paper-based or in-person testing, if you remember, students often were not allowed to write in the test booklet. They had to transfer all their answers, especially for multiple choice tests, to an answer sheet. And that's where students with SPLDs, they made a lot of mistakes because, you know, they, instead of option A, they colored option B and so on. So that's an accommodation that you can offer if you use this type of response format. And for some tests, again, not necessarily for language tests, students can use spelling assistive devices or some visual organizers. Accommodations in timing are very frequently offered. I'm going to talk about them in a bit more detail. Extended time, as you have mentioned, is a frequent accommodation. Offering multiple or frequent breaks can be very helpful for students, especially those with ADHD, attention deficit disorder. Changing in testing schedules, so not for some students having a test very early in the morning is not very helpful. I actually think early morning tests are not very good for teenagers overall. And then testing over multiple days. So for some students with certain disabilities, they can't cope with a 4-hour test, for example, because it makes them so tired. And sometimes, again, pre-COVID, accommodations in setting can be provided. For example, administering the test individually. Now it's done often through the computer, testing in a separate room, testing in small groups. This is very helpful for students with ADHD because they can be really distracted by noises. So one student drops a pencil and their attention is somewhere else already. Adjusting the lighting, so students with autism spectrum disorder, they are very sensitive to lighting, temperature, etc. So again, that can be offered to students with computer-based testing. Again, when you do it in your own home, the advantage is that you can do it yourself. And then providing noise buffers can be helpful for students with autism spectrum disorder or students with ADHD. So that's again, with computerized testing, maybe that's not necessary anymore. So these are the accommodations that I have collected that high stakes language testing organizations provide. So I just wanted to ask you if you have any other ideas or accommodations or ways that you use in addition to these. You can put them in the chat. I can see Evila has put in the chat that that there is she shortened the headings, the text of the activities, divide the text into 2 columns, place students in a separate room, give personal support, and quite a lot of accommodations, Avila. So that's really great. You're doing already a lot for your students. Marcio has said that they allow students to be assessed in other ways, orally, for example, if they have problems with writing. A different room, Gladys, yes, some organizations already offer it. Okay, so you can still feel free to put things in the chat and we can revisit them. Just one moment, I just stop at the, yeah, Evila put it in the question and answer session as well. Okay, well, feel free to put questions and as they come up, if I can stop for a moment, I'll stop and look at the questions. Right, so one quick key question that particularly is important for students with dyslexia is that how we can support these students, particularly when it comes to the assessment of reading. because proficiency, language proficiency in English or in any other language includes reading and spelling. But these are exactly the areas of challenge for dyslexic students. So the best way to support them would be to reduce the amount of reading they have to do and not to consider their spelling. But the problem is that the construct of language proficiency does include reading and does include spelling ability, although in our modern world, perhaps spelling is becoming less important. But how can we find this balance between accommodations and test fairness? So that's a question that I've been asking also myself as somebody doing research in this area. And one accommodation or adjustment that we often offer, and you have mentioned it in the chat as well, is reading aloud the text that the student has to comprehend. My problem with read aloud is that it might be helpful for students with dyslexia, but it doesn't cover, or it doesn't fully assess. If we allow the students to see the text and listen to the text at the same time, we are not fully assessing word level decoding skills, the ability to decode words from paper. And word decoding is part of the reading comprehension construct, both in our first languages and in the second language. And in read aloud, students may not decode the written form of the words. So read aloud is really a modification. We can't just say that it's an accommodation. So we are changing the construct. But the question that we have been asking ourselves with some colleagues is whether it actually helps and supports dyslexic students in understanding text, because then in some classroom assessment contexts, we can use this accommodation. And also we need to acknowledge that a lot of our reading and text comprehension is becoming multimodal in this world. We watch videos with subtitles, we listen to audiobooks. Most course books have transcripts, video recordings at the same time. So maybe we really actually should consider multimodal text comprehension as a component of language comprehension. So we did a study that I'd like to just very briefly talk about, where with colleagues in Slovenia, where they also teach, it's a tiny country in Europe, but they also teach English as a foreign language in classrooms. And we were interested in to what extent the mode of presentation, written, auditory, or combined written auditory, dyslexia status, so whether a student is diagnosed with dyslexia or not, and text difficulty influence how these students understand texts in English. And another advantage of conducting this research in Slovenia was that they have a very good identification system for dyslexic students. So we could actually be certain, or fairly certain, that if a student came with a dyslexia diagnosis, they were indeed dyslexic. And if someone didn't have a dyslexia diagnosis, then in all likelihood, they were not dyslexic. So just very briefly, let me show you the results. In this slide, you can see that dyslexic and non-dyslexic students do differ quite dramatically in their reading comprehension. So when you ask them to read a text with short answers, these were 11-year-old children having studied English after 2 or 3 years. So relatively early stages of English exposure, whereas non-dyslexic students score around between 70 and 80%, depending on whether the text is difficult or easy. Dyslexic students score 44% and 56%. So after 2 or 3 years, these students already lag behind their non-dyslexic peers, and they do have difficulties understanding texts, no matter whether they are easy or a bit more difficult. What happens when we record a text, the same text, and we ask them to listen to it without reading? What we see is that, first of all, the listening component becomes a bit more difficult for everybody because students have to remember the information. So one lesson is actually that if you assess listening with the text, which was originally meant for reading, students may not do so well on it because reading and listening texts do differ actually, and reading texts are much more dense with information than listening texts. So everybody's doing a bit worse. But what is interesting is the remarkably big difference still between dyslexic and non-dyslexic students in this slide. So dyslexic students find it particularly challenging to understand spoken text, remember information, particularly if the text is difficult. You can see they only score 30% on this test. So what happens when they can listen and read the same text together? Basically, that equalizes performance for almost everybody. Even for the difficult tests, the dyslexic students are getting relatively close to non-dyslexic students. With the easy text, they are still, doing a bit worse than their non-dyslexic counterparts. But overall, the dyslexic students are catching up with non-dyslexic students if we allow them to read and listen at the same time. So why does this happen? Because listening, particularly to the difficult text, which is, perhaps is more unknown vocabulary, which is slightly more complex syntactically, this listening relieves the students from the burden of decoding these written words visually. And that frees up attentional resources for the students, and they can pay more attention to what the text was about, and they have more resources for higher level text comprehension. So it seems that dyslexic students actually benefit from reading aloud, and they benefit a bit more than non-dyslexic students, particularly when the text is difficult. So what can we conclude from this study is that in low stakes assessment contexts, read aloud might assist students with dyslexia to demonstrate their comprehension ability, especially if the text is difficult. And we can hypothesize, we don't have direct evidence, but we do think that this opportunity to use this read aloud modification might lower students' text anxiety, because dyslexic students will become anxious if they have to read particularly longer text. And if they know there will be also an opportunity to listen to the text, they might be less anxious, they might do better, and that can boost their self-confidence. And perhaps we think that it can also, in the long run, increase engagement with reading and motivation to read more. And of course, if you use this change in high stakes assessment, you have to inform the users of the test information that the students' reading ability wasn't assessed using just a written test. So you have to make a note on this on the test certificate, but you can offer this to the students. So I just stop here for a moment to see the question. Okay, well, there is a question that I can later answer. Okay, so yes, let me go back. The next frequent accommodation that you have mentioned in your answers to my question, what is it that you offer to students, is more time. And very interestingly, all exams offer a lot more time, or actually we don't even know how much more time they offer. They offer 50%, some offer 25%, and there are some guidelines based on what kind of difficulty test centers offer 25% and some offer 50%. But what we have found, and was quite shocking, was that there is no research on how actually students with dyslexia and whether students with dyslexia benefit from extra time. Does it really help them? So we designed a study with the support of the British Council, and we were using their Aptis for Teens test, which is a computer administered test with multiple choice questions. And we use the standard timing that the Aptis test provides. And we also added an extended timing condition. And we were interested in whether students with different first language literacy profiles benefit from this extended time. We didn't use dyslexia diagnosis because this study was conducted in Hungary, where I am originally from, and we don't have a very reliable dyslexia diagnosis system, unlike in Slovenia. So statistically, it's actually possible to administer some tests that can predict whether students might have dyslexia and use that as a variable. So we didn't have official dyslexia diagnosis. So this is the research design. Students took two versions of the test, one under standard timing condition and the other one under extended timing condition. We assess the students' first language comprehension as well. How well do they understand the text in their own language? And we administered kind of 3 quick tests that can be indicative of dyslexic type difficulties. So what the results showed were quite interesting. We found no effect of the extended time. And we found that extended time didn't improve performance on any of the tasks. So the EPTIS test has shorter reading tasks, very short ones, sentence level ones, and it also has a longer one. I mean, you have to be aware that in this test, the longest text was 350 words. So maybe with other tests such as IELTS or Cambridge First Certificate of Proficiency, which are longer texts and more difficult, you might find different results. But we found no effect of extra time. What we also discovered was that the way the EPTIS test was originally designed, the time allotted for the test was actually sufficient for 95% of the participants. We measured how long students took to perform all the reading tasks, and there was one student, there were a couple of students who exceeded the time limit in the extended condition. We know that they worked longer than they would have had they had the standard time, but none of these students had actually lower literacy profile or a specific learning difficulty. And what we have found when we measured how long students take on the test is that the current time, so the typical standard time for the EPTIS test, is actually about 35% longer than an average student needs to perform on that test. And what we have then calculated was that if we take the student who was the slowest, who took 35 minutes instead of 24, then in order to make sure that everybody can complete the test, what we can do is to measure how long an average student takes the test, which was 24 minutes. And if we add 50% to the average, then everybody has the time and the opportunity to display what they know in a reading text. So the results from this, the results from this actually call for more care establishing how long a typical student or a larger population of students takes to perform a task. And it would be, if you design a test, particularly if it's high stakes, try to pilot it, get 20, 30 students, do the test, measure what is the average, and then add 50% to that. Because then nobody will need, or hopefully very few people will need extended time, then everybody will be able to finish the task. Because what we have also found was that the slow students are not necessarily the ones who have a disability. So we just have slow students among our students without having any diagnosis of a specific learning difficulty. Right, so that's timing. And now I'd like to move over to some ideas, questions that we need to ask ourselves when we make decisions on special arrangements. And the first question that you can see on this slide is a basic one. how the arrangement influences the validity of the assessment. And I have shown you, for example, that the read aloud is a modification. It does affect the construct, so that does affect the validity of the assessment. Timing may not affect the validity of the assessment. We're still assessing the same construct. So the fact that you give 50% more time for students to read will not make the construct different. Usually we don't read under time pressure unless, you know, something says, you know, high voltage, don't touch, right? Maybe that you have to read quickly, but otherwise we don't read novels quickly. I mean, we don't have all the time in the world to read academic text if we have to write an essay, but you know, some variation in our reading speed can be built in to assessment. Then the next question that we need to ask ourselves and consider carefully is what the students' strengths and weaknesses are resulting from their specific learning difficulty or other disability. And taking those strengths and weaknesses into account, then look into what kind of learning and instructional strategies work best for the student. And then apply these in our teaching, but also consider how these then can be used in assessment context. Because, for example, I have worked in Austria, and students with SPLDs do have a lot of support if they have dyslexia in the classroom while they are learning the language and in classroom assessment. But then when it comes to high stakes assessment, like the school leaving exam, they don't have any accommodations, and that is obviously not the right practice. Then obviously we also need to consider whether the student needs arrangements at all. There are some students who might not need them or who might not want them because they don't want to be singled out. And another question to ask is what arrangements might increase the students' access to instruction and assessment. So that ties back to what I said about learning and instructional strategies. If you are working in a test center, you can, and you have to make decisions about how you could support the student better. You can also interview the student and ask them what arrangements they have tried in classrooms, for example, how they have worked, what they prefer, and how we can improve the students' use of the arrangement. So, for example, if you're using a reader or a scribe, students need to get used to that. We can also think about, okay, what other arrangements can we offer to the students? What should they try? Can they practice using those arrangements? And what are the challenges in providing these arrangements? So if you are a big test center, for example, and you have like 1,000 students taking your test, obviously you have constraints in terms of how many rooms you have, how many supervised breaks you have to your students, etc. So again, some practicalities unfortunately need to be also taken into account, because you know, not all the test centers have all the resources in the world available to them. So moving on from these considerations, and briefly revisiting the idea of universal design, getting closer to some of the tips that I would like to give you, is if you remember, universal design is making sure that the tests are accessible for students. Universal design in education has 9 principles. I have just singled out 3 of these principles. Principle number 1, which talks about providing options for perception, and that's basically test input. And we should consider how we can offer ways of customizing the display of information, and also in this adaptable technology world, how we can make sure that students can adjust things for themselves, the background, the font size, etc. We can think about how we can offer information through multiple channels, visual and auditory. For example, whether it's possible to read out the text, the task instructions, to have a little icon that reads out the task instruction for the students so that they don't have to just read. So that was principle number one. Principle number two, providing options for language, making sure that the students actually understand what they need to do in a test, clarifying vocabulary and symbols, clarifying syntax and structure, and supporting text comprehension. What it means is that a lot of the tests are monolingual, and a lot of the tests that you probably administer, or the test instructions themselves, are in English. We have to make sure that if that's the case, then the vocabulary is clear, that the students would know what they need to do, that it's not unnecessarily complex, and perhaps we can illustrate what students need to do through multiple media. If you provide instructions in the student's first language, Portuguese, then again, the same applies. Make sure that you don't use, complex vocabulary that the students may not understand, or if you have multilingual learners for whom Portuguese is their second language and English is their third, then how you can make sure that they still understand the instructions if they are in Portuguese, for example. And then principle 4, providing options for physical action. It may not be always possible, for example, in high stakes tests, but if you use classroom tests, you have mentioned that you can vary the methods in which the students respond to a task. So sometimes you can ask the students to record themselves speaking instead of writing an essay, making sure that there are no physical barriers, how students write, for example, what the desk is like, how much space they have, etc. And then optimizing access tools and assistive technologies. They are becoming so widespread and so much part of the writing construct. For example, spell checkers. Everybody uses spell checkers nowadays. So if I were to design a writing test, I would definitely allow students to use a spell checker, because that's already built in Word, and making sure that students can know how to use a spell checker, and then allow them to use it. So that moves me on to another important area for high stakes assessment, and those of you who work in high stakes assessment perhaps might want to consider these. Sometimes what I have found when I looked for information on what special arrangements are available for students was that the information wasn't easily accessible. I had to search multiple home pages under various links, and it was all hidden. So consider where that information is located, how easy it is to find it, how is it worded. I mean, some of these special arrangements policies are worded in such a complex manner that sometimes even I have difficulties understanding them. Is it available in the student's first language? And is it, how long is it? Is it very, very long? Is it comprehensible for the students? Because if you have to apply for special arrangements, imagine you have dyslexia and you've got this 20-page document to read in English, how to apply for special arrangements, then obviously you will not be able to do it unless you enlist the help of your teacher or your parents. But that's, again, not very fair because students should be able to do that themselves. And then also consider the procedures for applying for special arrangements, how complex this procedure is, what is the amount of information required, what are the costs associated with it. So what, for example, if you require a recent diagnosis of dyslexia, that can, in some countries, that can cost a lot of money, but students might have a diagnosis from 5 years ago and dyslexia doesn't go away. So why do some testing organizations require a diagnosis from, let's say, 2 years, when things really often don't change too much. So these are the issues that you might want to think about if you are involved in high stakes assessment design. So we will not do the Mentimeter because we are running out of time, and with so many participants, we can't do it. But maybe you could put it in the chat based on what you have learned so far in this talk, whether you would change any of your assessment practices to support students with disabilities to demonstrate their knowledge. So that's one question you can write about in the chat. And the other question is perhaps what tips you would give to your colleagues who weren't here today for assessment. So I give you maybe a couple of minutes to put it in the chat. Right, so Gladys, yes, you definitely need to know your students better. Yes, I think that's very important, because without knowing your students better, you will find it difficult to offer relevant adjustments. Andrea will start with read aloud. That's great. Thank you, Andrea. Okay, Marcio, that's a fantastic idea to include more time between listening questions and the test. So give students more time to read the questions. Yes. Yes, so that's if I do, so just going back to Marcio's comment, if I work with testing organizations, I often advise them that any component of the test that requires reading, that's where students would actually benefit from more time. And the question is whether everybody would benefit from more time, not just students with disabilities, right? So Jacqueline likes the idea of the spell checker. Miriam, you need to know more about the disability. Yes, we need to know better, need to know our students better to think about the solutions. Yes, and hopefully that's possible. I mean, I know class sizes can be quite big. Right, okay, you can maybe put in more tips while I'll show you my tips. And then we can go over to the Q&A. Right, okay, so this is the summary of my tips. Well, first of all, I think it's important to leave sufficient time for everybody to complete the test, where time pressure is not part of the test construct to be assessed. And to be honest, it's only for speaking where we have a real time pressure in second language production and comprehension. I also believe that multimodal presentation of test instructions might help test takers understand how to perform the test task. So giving them listening information, maybe even visual clues with gestures, etc. The visual layout of tests should follow accessibility guidelines. Dyslexia associations have accessibility guidelines. In the UK, we have very detailed accessibility guidelines for how we present information. They need to be consulted, and please try to follow them. In our experience, I can also say that test takers with specific learning difficulties usually do better in tasks that have selected response formats, where they don't have to write long answers. So where they can match things, where maybe they have to choose the right answer or underline the right answer. Task formats where they have to write a lot, that's where they might be struggling. Then you need to also consider the amount of reading and writing needed in the assessment. So that goes back to the previous point. If there's a lot of reading and writing required, think about timing, etc. And going back to Marcio's suggestion, not only giving more time for students to read the listening questions, but also previewing the questions before listening helps students with SPLDs, but also everyone, to focus their attention on the relevant parts of the listening text to be comprehended. Because in real life, we always listen for a purpose. We never listen in a vacuum. You know that, for example, my talk is going to be about dyslexia. I'll tell you what the 3 parts of my talk will be. I will refer back and forth, whereas if you are exposing students to a listening text, they sit there and they don't really know what's coming, and it can be anything. So we can actually help them focus their attention and activate their knowledge already about what can happen in that listening test. You can introduce self-paced listening Nowadays, again, technologically, it's not very complicated, where students can stop the recording and replay it if they don't understand something. That's, again, very often part of the multimodal listening or viewing construct in this technological world. We can stop a YouTube video, we can stop Netflix and rewind and listen again. And when you listen to a conversation, unless it's like this, you can actually tell the other one, hey, I didn't understand what you have said. Can you repeat it? And even in lectures, you can raise your hand and say, sorry, I didn't understand that. Can you please repeat that, teacher? Captions for video input is very helpful for students again. And that, again, I guess many of you, even though you're highly proficient, you still watch English films with captions. And you might want to consider some more forms of alternative assessment for students with SPLE, such as portfolios, multimedia projects, more integrated tasks where students watch something and then speak about it, etc. So these are my tips. I'll check back on your tips in the chat in a moment, but that takes me to the end of my presentation. And for more detail, you can read about our research. There is also a chapter we have written about this, and I haven't put our my project, my personal dyslexia website on the slides, but I'll put it in the chat in a moment, and you can check out. I have a lot of recordings and lots of resources for teachers there. So thank you for your attention, and let me move over to the chat and questions.
Hi, Judith. I think we have a question from Evila and another one from Gladys.
Mm-hmm. Would you like to read it out? Or, I mean, I can see that Gladys's question was in the chat, that giving more time to students can actually increase their level of anxiety. And I think, Gladys, you might be actually right. So sometimes for some students, giving more time can actually raise their anxiety levels. So maybe giving, again, generous standard time for everybody might be the solution. Right, I can't see Evila's question. I can go over to the, is it in the Q&A?
No, it's she wrote in the chat box right before Gladys. She said, good morning, Judith. How can we improve the usage of these technologies to engage students in the classroom? It was right in the beginning.
All right, I remember that question. Okay, so Evila, if I understand your question right, and then you can kind of come back to me in the chat. I think I often talk about it that that we assume that our students are digitally savvy and they know how to use digital technology, and yes, to some extent that's true, but very often when it comes to educational technology, students are not as competent as we would believe. So I think it's important to practice these technological tools in the classroom. So for example, even the use of spell checkers. Sometimes I find that my master's students don't know how to use the spell checker. So spending time on this in the classroom, trying it out, is really helpful. And actually showing students that, for example, if you have an institutional subscription to Microsoft Office, then you have a read aloud function in Microsoft Word. You can import a text and it reads it out for you. Then also you have Microsoft Word can read out a text that you type for yourself. You can also dictate to Microsoft Word, and it's getting better even with accents. So even with my Hungarian accent, it is working. Then, for example, PowerPoint can do subtitles, automatic subtitles. And again, it's getting pretty accurate. So there are lots of technological tools that can support the students. And there are lots of other apps that help concentration, for example, or mind maps that help students organize their ideas. There are, tools that you pay for, like Grammarly, which corrects your grammar, but you can also use some corpus-based tools to check, for example, whether something is actually correct in English. So there are lots of technological tools that can support the students, but you need to build that into your classroom. and show it to the students, because often they wouldn't, most of them do work it out for themselves, but not everybody. Okay, so I hope that has answered the question, Evila.
It has. We have a few extra minutes, and I would like to ask you something. How do you see the impact of the movement last year with the pandemics of going remote, the full teaching going remote, including the assessment component of the teaching and learning process? How do you think it impacted the student with special disabilities, special needs?
Right. I mean, I did talk about it in my IHFL plenary, and it had advantages as well as disadvantages. So to start with the with the advantages, for students being online, it gives them a bit more flexibility. They can stand up. They don't have to sit in the classroom. They have a bit more freedom about the timing of certain activities. You know, I think language teaching also has become perhaps more, you know, project-based. You ask students to do more things using multimedia. And also in assessment, you need to move away from the traditional classroom tests because students can cheat, right? So you probably use much more project-based and portfolio assessment in your teaching. So this is advantageous for students with specific learning difficulties. What is not advantageous is, for example, if you use a method of teaching where you communicate with the students a lot in writing, for example, through Moodle, and if you are sending a lot of tasks to the students in the written format and the instructions what to do in the written format, then autonomy is a two-edged sword. If you don't know how to organize your time, then you can easily get lost in this online space. And again, students with ADHD, they might get lost, and you don't, you know, you can't really pay attention to them physically in the classroom. So you can easily miss those students who are struggling, and they can easily you know, switch off while they are online. So there are, and they may not have access to the technologies, they may not know how to use those technologies. So it can have a positive as well as a negative effect on students with SPLDs, and this is why I do think that it's important, even in online environments, to follow these students and check regularly on them, that they are progressing, they are doing the tasks, etc.
Okay, well, Judith, I would like to thank you on behalf of São Paulo Open Center for your amazing contribution. It was a pleasure to have you here with us. And welcome to come back more often, okay?
Yes, thank you. And I'll see you for the panel discussion later this morning, this afternoon for me. But yes, thank you. Thank you. Bye. Bye.